What up, Wizards? It's Dev from The Place, and today we got something a little bit different for you because, it's the year 20XX, so Magic the Gathering just doesn't feel as Magic the Gathering anymore. Stop me if you've heard that one before, but usually the way I like to respond to those feelings when I have them is to jump into Scryfall and look at all the old sets to remind myself why I stay and why I fell in love with Magic the Gathering in the first place. And this time, while I was doing that, while I was nostalgia baiting myself, I noticed that actually a lot of these cards have unique playable effects, in Commander at least. They haven't been printed a million times, and most importantly, they're actually surprisingly cheap. So I did what I do best, which is to write a bunch of Magic cards down on a piece of paper. It's my only talent. Shh, don't tell him it's not a talent. It's all he's got in life, but either way, I thought it would be like good information, or at the very least fun, to point out a bunch of cards from the Golden Age that you can afford right now with just a couple of bucks in your pocket. A lot of them are pieces of history. Fair number of these are on the reserve list, and a lot of them still very much playable in EDH. So now you can introduce a whole new generation of players to broken yet forgotten cards that have been washed over by the sands of time, and all at the cost of just a few dozen dimes. Let's take a look at a bunch of affordable and playable cards from the Golden Age.
And I'm your favorite Magic Channel's favorite Magic Channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck tech.
And we're back. Remember to check out the Patreon, but I want to go ahead and jump into it because we have a lot of sets to get through. And we're going to go set by set through 20 Golden Age sets. We're going to stop after Urza's block. You could argue that Mask's block and Invasion block are part of Golden Age. Maybe we'll do those at a later date, but for now, I think 20 sets is enough. Now, we're going to start all the way back in Beta Edition here, and let me go ahead and tell you that for the most part, I'm going to try to keep cards on this list at like $5 and under, but that's really difficult to do in Beta and Arabian Nights, for what that's worth. We'll get to it in a second, but the other thing that I'm going to try to do on this list is give you mostly unique cards that haven't been printed into the ground. That is also kind of difficult to do with Beta and still find cheap cards, but there is stuff like Instill Energy, which stopped being printed after 5th edition. If you want a 5th edition copy, it's like $1, but if you want a Beta edition copy, it's like $25, and to be honest, an uncommon from Beta for $25 at the low end is not that bad, and Instill Energy is a pretty playable piece that'll allow you to repeat, activations on creatures like mana abilities and a bunch of other stuff, so I think it's a pretty playable card at just 1 green mana. Goes in Enchantress decks and stuff well too. There's also a card like, say, Tsunami, which I found for $19 on the lowest end. This is not going to do everything to everyone at a Commander table, but it'll sure make the blue players very upset. So it might not take out their entire mana base, but in the right pod, this will do a lot of damage to 1 or 2 players, and $19 for a Tsunami with that gorgeous art from Beta Edition is not a bad call. But I guess finally, one of the cheapest cards you can get from Beta that I think you can still play in Commander is Pestilence. This was printed all the way up until Urza's Saga, and then they kind of stopped printing it. So you can get 50-cent copies of Pestilence, but as far as Beta Edition goes, you can get this for $10 on the lowest end right now, and I think that is actually a pretty good deal for a very Commander playable card. From Beta? Yeah, man. But I'm going to move on to both Unlimited and Revised Edition here. Kind of at the same time. You can tell me whether or not you consider that cheating down there in the comments section, but I just want to point out the same card from both sets, or the same cards at least. So I'll start here with Smoke. This was only ever printed up until 5th edition as well, and most of the different editions that it was printed in are all similarly priced. So that said, if you want an Unlimited Edition one, that'll cost you about $9 on the low end right now, and I think that's a pretty good deal for a card like Smoke from Unlimited. But if you want it from Revised, it'll cost you a whole $2, which I think is a much better deal in a lot of cases, and Smoke is a great card. Just look at how annoying that would be. You only get to untap 1 creature during the untap phase. That would get pretty irritating pretty fast, and sometimes irritating cards can be really powerful. I think another good pick from these sets is Island Sanctuary. It's only $1 from Revised right now. Great deal. But from Unlimited, it'll cost you $10 or $11. Still not a bad deal for what it is, considering it's a really playable card too. We used to combo this with Howling Mine back in the day to where we'd still effectively get a card during our draw step, but now a bunch of different creatures can't attack us. So pretty decent, especially considering we have a bunch more Howling Mine effects now that we can play in our commander decks, draw a bunch of cards during our draw step, and just skip one of those draws to kind of get a moat style effect, you know. Island Sanctuary, still a really potent magic card. It's actually pretty efficient to cast. Only a couple of mana for this effect is a steal. But let's move on to the very first Magic the Gathering expansion, Arabian Nights. This doesn't feel like Magic the Gathering argument started all the way back in 1994 with this set, and we've been hearing it for 30 years ever since. I think that it's definitely an argument with more credence nowadays than back then. Arabian Nights was a cool set, and it was also very difficult to find cards that fit the bill for this video. From Arabian Nights, I had to resort to Quambaj Witches for one of these entries. I've got a better entry in a second, but Witches is kind of my honorable mention for Arabian Nights. First of all, this has been printed a couple of other times, notably in Chronicles, and you can get those versions for relatively cheap, but there's just something to be said about, you know, an old school black bordered Magic card with that gorgeous folio art. Doesn't matter if it's Kaya or Phil, they both always knock it out of the park. You gotta love that stuff. But apart from that, just think of how good like Orcish Bowmasters is. You can get an idea of why Quambaj Witches has been kind of a great card throughout its history in Magic the Gathering. It's still somewhat playable in Pauper, big air quotes around somewhat. Like 5 years ago it was playable in Pauper, but apart from that, again, like this could be a decent commander card depending on what you're doing in like a mono black burn deck. You'd be surprised how often it can take a creature out. And it's only like $4 to get a heavily played copy on TCG Player right now, and again, I think that's a pretty good deal for a card as cool as this. But if you want a real entry, a lot of air quotes, if you want a real entry from Arabian Nights, I think a good one is Sandals of Abdallah. This is only about $12 on the low end right now, and again, relative to a lot of the cards in Arabian Nights, that is a really, really good deal to give your creatures kind of a form of unblockability against a bunch of different decks. And obviously, there are ways to make some of your opponent's lands be islands, even if they don't have islands in the first place. But at most pods, this will allow you to get in on at least like half of the players at the pod. Like 2 people on the pod with, you know, effective unblockability. So it's actually not a terribly like bad card, you know. Again, form of unblockability is something you welcome in Commander, so I kind of like it, and I think the $12 is not too much to ask. Also worth pointing out that Sandals is our first reserve list card, and that's going to kind of come into play more and more as we move through the list here. Like with Antiquities, both cards I want to point out are on the reserve list here, starting with Haunting Wind. This is a whole like $8 at the lowest end to get right now if you want like a moderately played copy, and I think that's a steal for a really unique effect. Black doesn't really get to do much about artifacts, and even though this doesn't blow any artifacts up, it still punishes people for using them, whether the abilities have a tap in their activation or not. But that just means anytime somebody tries to tap down Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Felwar Stone, Mind Stone, whatever, they're taking a point of damage. That's pretty slick for like mono black burn decks and maybe even Aristocrats piles that are just trying to pile on the pings as much as possible. This will be an irritating card for a lot of opponents, and sure, black kind of has a lot of those, but just add another one to the pile, and again, really unique effect that not a whole lot of black cards can do. Now, the other Antiquities card I want to point out is Damping Field. This too is on the reserve list. You can get it for a whole $3.50 right now, and it's kind of like Smoke. Remember we looked at Smoke earlier? That just lets you untap one creature during untap step. This will allow you to only untap one artifact during untap step. So a little bit like, you know, Haunting Wind that we just looked at. This may not blow up artifacts, but it's still going to do something about them. You know, a Winter Orb, again, a lot like Smoke, a Winter Orb, but this time for artifacts, could be a great card depending on the pod, but in most pods, again, people play mana rocks and stuff, so this could be a really annoying card. Well, let's move on to Legends, which turned out to be the actual most difficult set to find cheap playables from. It turns out if you're from Legends and you're playable, you're worth $1 billion. If you're not playable, you're worth like $1 or $2. Right. So that said, I think someone has made a mistake here because Spectral Cloak is only $2 and it's only ever been printed in Legends ever. It's kind of wild. Not part of the reserve list, just never reprinted ever again, and it's actually kind of playable. It just gives your creature Shroud while it's untapped. A couple of ways you can game that. You tap the creature down, and now you can cast auras and stuff on it. I kind of like that about it, but there's also the fact that if you play it on like a Vigilant creature's just shrouded for the rest of the game, and that could be pretty good, depending on like your commander, what you're playing in your deck. So I think $2 for a playable from Legends, that's not a bad deal at all, but that said, it started to get really hard after I found this card. I guess the best thing I could do for you after that is probably Reset, which has been reprinted, is not on the reserve list, but it's only been reprinted once, and that was in Mystery Booster 2. Who even knows that set exists? So I will say too, its reprinting was relatively recent, if that matters to you, but this is only about $15 on the low end from Legends right now, and it's just 2 mana to untap all your lands. You have to play it on your opponent's turn. Okay, so that's a pretty good time to play it, honestly. So I really, really like this and all the things it could potentially do for you. Untapping all your lands seems pretty busted to me. That said, I guess if you did want a cheap reserve list card from Legends and you just won't live with yourself if I don't give you that, there's Quorum Trench Gnomes. I was completely unaware this card existed, even though, I played back in the old day. I've never seen this thing in my life. It's like $8 to $10 on the lower end to get a copy of this. It is on the reserve list, and it does mess with planes, which I guess could be a neat ability on a commander table, but play it at your own risk. But if you want a cheap reserve list card from this set, it's this. Let's move on to my favorite of the Four Horsemen sets. It's the Dark. We actually just reviewed this entire set in a speed run on Twitch the other night. Put it on the YouTube channel. Watch it if you got a couple extra hours one of these days while you're cleaning or working or whatever you do on the other side of your mobile device. But there are a couple of cards from the Dark that are on the reserve list, very cheap to buy, and again, I think are really playable. Like Martyr's Cry is a pretty decent example of this. Just a couple of white mana, exiles all white creatures, and then you draw cards for each creature that was exiled this way. Everyone that lost creatures in this exchange gets to draw the cards, but obviously you could set this up to where you lose a few creatures you don't really care about that much and you draw like 6. Not a bad deal, especially if you have tricks that'll allow you to, blink some of your creatures out of existence for the rest of the turn, and then play Martyr's Cry to remove all your other creatures that you don't really care about. And then you draw cards, the rest of your guys blink back in, you're having a good time. So there's a few ways to use this, and for what it's worth, even though it will draw your opponents some cards, it will also still exile all of their dudes, and that seems like a pretty good play, again, depending on the pod. So only $3 for this card, I think, is a pretty good deal considering when you really look at it, it's just an efficient sweeper. There's also Gaia's Touch from the Dark. This is not on the reserve list, but it's never been printed outside of the Dark ever. They could reprint it at some point in like a Commander product or whatever, but they just haven't yet, which is a huge surprise. The card is only about $2 right now, and it is a steal considering I actually think this is one of the best cards in the Dark for Commander, no lie. In mono green, or really any deck with basic forest, this allows you to drop an extra basic forest every turn, and it's only 2 mana to get on the table. When you're ready, you can sacrifice it for 2 more green mana, so that makes a lot of mana potentially just the second turn that it's in play, or even the first turn it's in play. There's a lot of little moves you can make with this card, not to mention the fact that it triggers Enchantress and stuff, and only $2 for that in like a landfall deck is a really, really good deal. Gaia's Touch is among the best cards in the set. It's only a couple of bucks. But now we got to move on to Fallen Empires. Can you believe there's affordable cards in Fallen Empires? Yeah, you could probably get this entire set for a book of matches and a back rub, but there are good cards in the set. Like Rainbow Veil is on the reserve list, and it's technically the most expensive card in the set. You can get it for a whole $250 on TCG Player right now. I think it's not a bad deal. It looks terrible. Well, when you first start reading it, it looks good till you get to the end. It's an untapped land that taps for mana of any color. Let's go. But at the end of the turn, you got to pass it over to a different opponent. And I guess there's politics involved there. Like, all right, who wants the Rainbow Veil? What are you going to give me for it and all that? But more likely, you can just sacrifice it before you have to throw it over to somebody else. Just sack it in like a Gitrog monster deck or any of the other decks that care about sacking lands, and then just replay it with a Crucible of Worlds, and now you don't have to pass it off to anybody EOT. So in decks that just get to kind of always have it, it's not a bad land, but that's a pretty narrow application. Still a cool card. I've always liked Rainbow Veil. Only a couple of bucks right now. But there's also Conch Horn, which is sneakily, subtly, the actual best Commander card in Fallen Empires. It's actually a really cheap way for any deck to draw cards and get kind of a mini brainstorm effect, which is pretty decent in most lists, it turns out, especially ones that want creative ways of drawing cards or artifacts that draw cards, which this is a thing that does that for reasonably cheap. And again, Foglio art. You get incredible folio art. And this is, again, among like the best Magic art of all time, and at least in my opinion. I think that the color palette's incredible. The lady looks amazing. And Yeah, maybe the best art in the set for what it's worth. So you get that, but you also get a reasonably playable card. There are some of those in Fallen Empires, it turns out. But now moving on to everyone's favorite set, Ice Age, or at least a lot of us that were playing back then. Ice Age was a pretty formative set for a lot of us. And looking through it, it's kind of tough to find spots for this list. Really, you're either very expensive if you're from Ice Age, or you were the rest of the set, which is most of the set. Under $1 for a lot of this stuff, which is kind of heartbreaking when you think about it, but there were a few good picks, stuff like Zurin Orb, for instance, hasn't been printed into oblivion, but it has been printed a few times. Just a really cool looking card that I think has a lot of Commander applications. Matter of fact, last time my cousin Jason visited, we played some 1v1 Commander, and I won the game with Zurin Orb, playing with Hope S-Time, sacrificed all my lands to Zurin Orb, gained like 34 life or something like that, and milled like 68 cards from his library at the end of the turn with Hope. It was a great little play. I have just recently won a game with Zurin Orb, which might be coloring my perceptions here, but I have always loved Zurin Orb, and I think it goes in a lot of decks, especially ones where you want to trigger life gain, or those aforementioned decks that want to sacrifice lands. Zurin Orb is right at home in. But if you want one of those playable reserve list picks that I know are so popular on lists like this, there's Altar of Bone, which is also popular on lists like this. I've seen a lot of creators bring up Altar of Bone in the last few years trying to get it some motion on it, and still, I don't think enough people really know about this card, man. It's effectively a creature tutor that allows you to sacrifice a creature. Yes, I said allows you to sack a creature in like your Abzan sacrifice deck or something. Goes really well in there and goes and finds your Blood Artist effect or your Sephiroth or whatever it is you're trying to grab from your deck. So any kind of tutor effect is going to be pretty decent in Commander, and this is basically a Diabolic Intent in a color combination that doesn't usually get it, and it's a whole $3 right now, which is a great deal. Let me just put it that way. Moving on through to alliances here. This is another pretty stratified set in terms of price. You're either really expensive and everybody knows about you, Lake of the Dead, Force of Will, or you're not worth anything at all. Or your Arcane Denial. I guess that happens sometimes too. But Arcane Denial is not the card I'm going to point out to begin with here. We're going to start with Kildoran Outpost. Now, there are a lot of lands in Commander nowadays that'll churn out little dudes, but Kildoran Outpost is still a pretty good one. This will require you to sacrifice planes or whatever, bounce of planes when you play it, but it's sack of planes when you play it, but that is fine considering, again, you've got Crucible of Worlds. But even if you don't have effects like that, you are often willing to pay that cost to get a creature factory into play. And for what it's worth, and I think it's worth a lot to a lot of people, it is on the reserve list, and you can get it for only about $4 right now. That, again, is a great deal for a Kildoran Outpost. It is won World Championships, and it can help you win games of Commander again. But, a card that's not on the reserve list and did get printed up to 6th edition that I nonetheless want to point out here is Storm Cauldron. First of all, a really cool looking card, and a cool card, period, man. This is actually kind of really neat in landfall decks. First of all, it's got that effect that a lot of landfall and other players like, which is just you get to play more lands every turn. But the irritating bit, or at least the bit that might look irritating when you first see it, is the thing that says that whenever a land is tapped for mana, you have to bounce it. Now, this is symmetrical. It works for all players, so it's going to be annoying for basically everyone at the table, except perhaps you, if you've got a Zeus Lost but Seeking or a bunch of other effects that allow you to play extra lands in a turn. And in a landfall deck, you usually have those guys anyway. So if you've got a Zeus and or 2 other effects on the table that let you do that, plus Storm Cauldron, you're dropping 4, 5, 6 lands in a turn anyway. And honestly, how many turns in a row do you have to do that to win the game anyway? But now let's move on to what might be my favorite set of all time in terms of overall design, the period of my life it reminds me of. The nostalgia factor is high with Mirage here. But that said, one of the first cards I'm going to point out here is a card that I don't really remember much from my youth. None of me or my buddies played this card. It's Chaos Sphere. It's a really, really neat card that basically like inverts flying and not flying, like what those abilities do. Really cool, chaotic card for a Commander table, and it costs $6 right now. This too is on the reserve list, so you don't have to worry about it getting printed out from under you if you worry about that kind of thing. I think a lot of people want cards to be reprinted more so that more people can afford them, but if you're the kind of person that's like, I want this to never get reprinted again, if you're that person, then I guess, again, rest easy. This won't get reprinted. And I think it's a pretty good deal right now, given the effect, again, the impact, which is of high level, that this will have on most Commander games. There's also Grim Feast out of Mirage. This is the card that, again, a lot of EDH players have taken more notice of over the last couple of years, but I don't think enough people know about it yet. There's a few Golgari decks and Abzan decks and the like that care about gaining life. If you're in Dina, Soul Steep, or whatever, this is an especially decent card. Your creatures, or your opponent's creatures, are going to be dying a lot anyway, so you might as well gain life when that happens. Why not? And just like Chaos Sphere, this too is on the reserve list, which in this case, I think is kind of lame. Honestly, I would have loved them to have been able to reprint Grim Feast into the ground, because they probably would have by now in a bunch of different Commander products. But since they can't do that, get them while you can still get them for about $6. But let's move into the first small set of Mirage block, Visions, and look first at Retribution of the Meek. This is a really interesting sweeper that is probably good in like Delny decks, because they're not playing, creatures over 2 power. Anyway, it's probably decent in Aristocrats. I would consider it in my list, at least, because most, again, of my creatures are relatively small, and it even saves your 3 power creatures, and you've got a few of those in Aristocrats. So I kind of like this. You mostly don't have to worry, if you build your deck correctly, about this sweeping your dudes, but it'll sweep all the most important guys at the table for only 3 mana, which is a good deal for only $5. And if it matters to you, this one too is reserve list, so they're not going to print it a bunch of times. This is another one that seems like they would have printed it a million times if they had the ability to do it, but they're not going to do that. If you want it, you got to get it from this set. But apart from that, there's also Breast Stealer's Crypt in Visions. This too is on the reserve list, and it's a really unique effect. They draw a card, they have to reveal it to everybody, which is already kind of neat. If it's a creature card, they have to choose whether to pay 3 life or discard the creature, which means whenever an opponent draws a creature, they're just going to pay 3 life to keep it in their hand. There's going to come a point where they can't do that anymore, which I think is really, really neat. But for the most part, forcing this decision on opponents is going to, first of all, get them really, really mad at you. But that doesn't matter, because you're probably dealing a lot of damage to a lot of people with a card like this. And yeah, it's symmetrical, but I think it's worth it for $4. You get a really unique effect here. But moving along, let's look next at Weatherlight, which never really felt like it was truly a set in this block. This kind of started the whole Gerard and the Weatherlight storyline, which would conclude 4 or 5 sets later, right? But this is a set that means a lot to us old timers, and there are still some good pieces in it. For instance, there is the Heater from the reserve list, Heat Stroke. Yet another red card that causes a lot of chaos on a game. This basically destroys all the creatures every turn that were blocked or did blocking. It doesn't matter how you participated in combat. If a block happened anywhere, you're dead at the end of combat, which is pretty insane. Just a really wild card that de-incentivizes all manner of blocking and can really throw a game into chaos. And I like that on my red enchantments, if you can't tell. I also like it when it's only like $3 for a reserve list card. It seems like a good deal to me, but so does Peacekeeper over here. This is about $6, so we couldn't quite keep it at $5, but this is probably the other card that I wanted to point out the most from Weatherlight, so I just kind of did it. This is another reserve list piece. You'll only ever get it from Weatherlight, and look at what it does. Creatures can't freaking attack. So you got to pay some mana every turn to keep those peace accords going, but it shouldn't be too difficult. Creatures can't attack is such a ridiculous line of text for a lot of decks, not even Pillow Fort, Turbo Fog, whatever, just a lot of decks. If you want Ghostly Prison in your deck, you might want Peacekeeper too. You may have noticed by now that it seems I missed Homelands. I did not miss Homelands. I just don't really care that much about Homelands. There's not a whole lot of reserve list stuff that you can actually find from that set, but there are decent cards like Primal Order, which is like $1 and has only ever been printed in like 5th edition apart from Homelands. But it's a good one that if you've got a lot of basic lands, again in like mono green or something, right, this could work pretty well. It does a lot of damage directly to your opponents during their upkeeps and stuff, so keep that card in mind. I think it's pretty good. But if you want a decent reserve list card, the most expensive card in all of Homelands is Koskin Falls, which is kind of like a propaganda or a ghostly prison effect for black decks. It costs a little bit more mana and it costs a little bit more resources, but it's still effectively a ghostly prison in a deck in a color that doesn't usually get it. For that, you have to pay like $10. Again, it's the most expensive card in Homelands, but even even the most expensive card in Homelands isn't actually that expensive. I would still call this affordable if you need an effect like this. Anyway, what were we doing? I guess Tempest was next. And Tempest, one of my favorite sets of all time for sure. I want to first look at Douthie Embrace. Now, this has only ever been printed one other time, I believe on the list. But apart from that, just Tempest and Tempest only. And it is only like $1.50 to get a copy of this card right now. And in case you don't know what Shadow is, giving a creature Shadow is basically unblockability. There are very, very, very few Shadow creatures. And even though there's one or two somewhat popular ones in Commander, I still don't think that you're going to come across too many most of the time. So giving a creature Shadow is basically just give a creature unblockability until end of turn, which is a pretty good thing to just have access to. This one not on the reserve list, but I still think it's definitely worth picking up. But if you do want a reserve list card from this set, and another one you can pick up for just like $1.50, it's a ridiculous deal for this card, check out Recycle, man. There are bad situations you can get yourself into with this card where you're kind of stuck and can't draw any cards, but there's lots of ways to avoid that situation. What this basically says is play a spell, draw a pair of cards, which is wild. That's so stupid, the kind of card draw engine this could potentially be. So look at this. It costs an awful lot of mana, but once it's in play, it is the engine of engines. Literally one of the better green card draw engines that's ever been printed, and is very cheap to get your hands on right now. Now, the next set in Tempest block is Stronghold, and a card that I want to point out here is Mortuary. This, just like a couple of other cards we've looked at already, is not reserve list, but it has only ever been printed in Stronghold, and this is a pretty strong effect for a lot of black decks. Matter of fact, there's a lot of really fun aristocrat strings with this card, where if you have something in play that allows you to draw a card when the creature dies, just sacrifice a creature, put it on top of your library, draw it again. You can do that as many times as you want, play it again, sack it, draw it, play it, sack it, draw it, and that leads to a lot of fun lines in aristocrats decks. So Mortuary is always a really fun card to have access to, and it's kind of amazing this has never been printed beyond this one set. Another card I could kind of say that about is Tortured Existence. This does have a printing on the list, but that's the only other printing Tortured Existence has, and it's got similar combos to Mortuary in some ways, right? You know, Mortuary allows you to like sack this thing, draw it again, play it, sack this thing, draw it again, play it, whereas Tortured Existence just kind of allows you to juggle two creatures back and forth between your graveyard and your hand, and now you're getting all of these ridiculous triggers, like whenever a card leaves your graveyard, for instance, whenever a creature card leaves your graveyard, whenever something does this or that, or blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of ways to trigger different effects, like Insidious Roots effects and whatnot, with Tortured Existence, and just kind of win the game for a very low amount of mana. So Tortured Existence might not be reserve list, but it is definitely a card that's worth the $3 you're going to pay for it, because it goes in a surprising amount of decks, and even if you're not like actively comboing off with it, it's still a good card. Now, Exodus is the final set in Tempest block. It's going to take us into Urza's block to finish things off here, but first we got to find some good stuff from Exodus, which was easier said than done, but I did like Wall of Nets to start things off. I don't remember this card from when I was a kid, and honestly, Tempest block is maybe the block that I played the most next to Urza, Saga, and Mirage. Those three blocks I played Magic like crazy during, and I just don't really remember Wall of Nets. It's actually pretty good though, not reserve list, but only ever printed in Exodus and no other set. This, when it blocks a creature, will exile that creature until Wall of Nets leaves the battlefield, and it's a 0/7, so it can block most creatures and exile them forever until they can deal with nets. So that's actually not terrible, again, in like Pillow Fort, Turbo Fog, whatever, Ghostly Prison kind of decks. The creatures that do get through can just get blocked by nets and they're gone forever. So if you want to de-incentivize attacking you, this is pretty decent for only about $2.50. But there's also Erratic Portal. I was kind of excited to talk about this one. Not reserve list either, but has also only ever been reprinted a couple of times beyond this one printing in Exodus. It's a neat little piece, you know. If you catch your opponent without too much mana, then you can always bounce their guys, which is cool. But probably the best thing about this is it allows you to bounce your own dudes back to your own hands. You can play them again to your own side of the battlefield and get their ETB triggers. So this does a lot. You know, it's a little bit expensive to get down in the first place, but once you do, it's only 1 mana to use its ability, and that is really, really cheap for what it's actually doing for you. And it's really, really cheap to order this card. It's only like $2.50, $3, I think, right now to get an Erratic Portal, and you'd be surprised how much this can actually do in a commander deck. And it's worth noting, you can play it in any commander deck. So if you have a good ETB trigger or two in your deck, consider Erratic Portal. But let's move into one of the most broken sets of all time, Urza's Saga, to talk about a card you probably never seen before. It's Bedlam over here. Boy, another set, another crazy red enchantment. Just, I love chaotic stuff, and red does that really well, or at least they used to do that really well. You know, the last card that we looked at, that was a red enchantment, like punishes people for making blocks or being blocked or whatever. This one, you just can't block. No one can block. Blocking isn't even a mechanic. Forget blocking exists. That's insanity. That is crazy that this card even exists in the first place. It may not be reserve list, but it has only been printed like one other time on the list. And right now it stands at about $5 to order from Urza's Saga, which I think is a really good deal for maybe the most eye-popping red enchantment of the video. And when you look at the last couple that we've seen, that's really saying something. But let's move on to Urza's Legacy, which has been picked clean. Honestly, people have speculated on this set to the point where it is very difficult to find cheap pieces that look playable to me in Commander, but I was able to come by at least a couple, and as you've noticed, a couple is all I really need for this video. So with that said, let's look at a card that I'm not sure you're going to like, but I do. It's called Subversion over here. Now, this isn't reserve list, but it's only ever been printed one more time in like a Battle Royale box set or something, so it's kind of difficult to come by copies of this card, and it's only about $2 right now. It is relatively expensive for what it does, but during your upkeep, everyone takes 1 damage, and you gain life equal to the life they lost that way. So I kind of like this as just, you know, an extra pinger effect in some decks, but I especially like it in maybe an Orzhov life gain list, because this will gain you a total of 3 life in a turn. That's a lot for a lot of different things in those life gain decks. You know, Griffin Eyrie is now guaranteed to give you a 2/2 flyer that turn because you gained the 3 life. There's a few things that care how much life you gained in a turn, and being able to start your turn effectively by gaining 3 life is probably pretty decent in a lot of those decks. So I like Subversion, but I'm not going to pretend it's the best card in the set. So, you know, give me a Second Chance. Second Chance is on the reserve list, and it's only $2.50, which is stupid considering what this card does. This is an extra turn card for reasonably cheap in terms of the mana cost, and it's only $2.50. Now, the problem is that you have to be at a low life total. You have to be like 5 or less life to actually use Second Chance, right? So that seems bad, but, you know, there are cards that allow you to lower your life total on your own. So I guess there's that. There's also, you know, decks that specifically want their life total to be reasonably low throughout the game. Think Cecil and other commanders like him. So I don't know. There are some decks that might want to play a card like this, and you definitely have to go into the danger zone, the red zone, in order to use this properly. But it is worth noting that you don't like exile this or anything. So if you have ways of getting it back, like the turn after you use it, just use it again. You're probably still at 5 life. Get it back, use it again. There's probably ways to take, you know, loops of extra turns with this card that are relatively easy to think up. So I really do think this card deserves not just a second chance, but a second look. But let's finish things off here with Urza's Destiny, another one that, you know, I was kind of surprised how many cards I like from this set. I knew I would like a lot of them, but surprisingly, there are a lot more bangers, in my opinion, from Urza's Destiny than there were from the last 2 sets, which are known as like the most broken sets ever. Urza's Destiny is kind of a personal favorite of mine, and it was easy to find cool cards from this one, like Carnival of Souls, which is on the reserve list and is only about $6 right now. It kind of looks like it sucks at first glance. You know, whenever any creature comes into play, including my opponents, I'm going to be losing life whenever that happens. Well, not if I have a Soul Warden in play. This is another one I think would be decent in like the black-white life gain decks, because again, as long as you've got something to kind of offset the life you're losing, then it becomes good. However, there's also the argument that even if you don't have something to offset the life, it's still okay, so long as you have a way to funnel the black mana into something on your opponent's turn. And once it's your turn, you start playing creatures, and you were rewarded mana for playing creatures, which can be really, really good even if you have to take a few points to the face. So this is the kind of mana production you don't often see in black, apart from like Dark Ritual and Cabal Ritual. Not a whole lot of ramp in that color, and this affords you ramp whenever a very common game action takes place. And again, I think $6 to plan your deck around that to an extent is a pretty good deal. And last card of the video is Aura Thief. Now, this one one has only been printed once in a list printing. Notice how often that happens. That's the only reprinting of this card. And the one from Urza's Destiny is like $5, $4 is what I've got written down in my notebook. So a pretty low price for this card. And have you had a chance to read the card yet? It doesn't really matter what the casting cost or the stats are on this, although the casting cost is reasonable enough that you would actually play it in a game of Commander. It's like 4 mana. And look at that. Look at that. You see that line of text? When this card dies, you gain control of all enchantments. Stupid line of text on this card. Why is this only $4? That is an unbelievable line of text. Whether you sacrifice it or you just wait for an opponent to swing into you, that'd be another thing I guess you could do, and just block with the Ara Thief. It's small enough that you can easily kill it that way. And now you have everyone's enchantments. Everyone's enchantments. It's Commander, man. Everyone's got like 5 enchantments. I don't know. On average, you probably get like 3 or 4 enchantments from this, but I think that is a really good deal. So Ara Thief is a crazy card that I never really paid much attention to back in the days of Standard when I was playing Urza's Destiny, but now that I see it again with fresh eyes, this card looks insane in EDH. But that is Itski Lewitsky for this one, at least. I'm sure that there are some other cards that I could have chosen from each of these sets to kind of highlight in this video, so if there's anything that I missed, then make sure you hit me up with it down there in the comments section. Again, I tried to mostly find things that were either on the reserve list or at the very least hadn't been printed into the ground, and I tried to keep the price reasonable for you. So again, there's anything else like that you know of, let me know in the comments section, because maybe I'll order a copy. I hope you enjoyed this video, you get something out of it, and if you did, make sure, even if you didn't, make sure you do all the YouTube stuff on your way out. Hit the button shaped like a thumb, can't miss it down there. Subscribe to the channel, trying to get to 150k subscribers. Should be a pretty amazing number, and we're only like 12k off. We can get there. We can get there together. But either way, check out the Patreon. I'll plug that one more time. It's only $1 a month, and to be honest, I kind of need it right now. It's YouTube. YouTube. Yeah, look, if you're on YouTube, you know that every creator on YouTube has been like, what happened to the views? Seriously, what happened to the views? So jump on over to Patreon if you want to help support the channel. It would mean a lot to me, but just as long as you're here, that means a lot to me too. So I will catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.